Hey ACT Prep students, I am here today to welcome you to the Math ACT. So this is the introduction to the math test. There will always be 60 questions in 60 minutes. That would equal out to one question per minute, but sometimes that's not the way we want to pace ourselves, so we'll get into that later. The questions address content from pre-algebra through trigonometry. So all the math that you've had in the past few years, you will probably use most of it on the test. The level of difficulty increases as you go through the test. So number 1, it should be the easiest question, and number 60 could be the hardest question on the test. The content by percent on the math test, you have pre-algebra, elementary algebra, and intermediate algebra, each comprising about 20%, maybe more heavily weighted in pre-algebra, which is great because it should be easier. Coordinate geometry and plane geometry, another 20% or so, maybe a little bit more plane geometry. Trigonometry should be just a few questions. If you don't know what trigonometry is, don't worry. It is not going to affect you that much on the test. And having 6 of these divisions is pretty convenient. If we have 6 weeks for ACT prep and we want to wrap that up in 6 weeks, we can practice 1 per week. Content by number of questions, if the percentages aren't very helpful to you, out of 60 questions, remember, for pre-algebra, elementary algebra, and intermediate algebra, we have about 33 questions about algebra. So if there are only 60 questions on the test and 33 are about some kind of algebra, that's over half. So, and the most questions about fractions, decimals, and percents, which you would have done a long time ago and probably have down by now and may just need to review a little bit. Elementary algebra would be Algebra 1, intermediate would be Algebra 2, and those you've done very recently, which is another advantage. If you move over to coordinate geometry, which would be like graphing, maybe lines and finding slopes and equations for lines, we've got 9 questions there. Another plane geometry subject like triangles and area, volume, different equations that you might have to recall and use would be 14 questions. That's actually pretty heavily weighted. And then a little bitty handful of trigonometry, which would include things like sine, cosine, and tangent. If you don't know what I'm talking about, again, not a big deal. To prepare for the math test, you're going to want to do 3 things. The first thing would be review the content, which I will help you do, and we will piece that out so we don't feel like we're reviewing years of math class in 1 week. That would not be reasonable, and it would be absolutely miserable. But to go back and memorize some of the equations you may be forgotten, but that you'll need on the test. So we'll go through that as well. And number 2, to learn strategies of how to answer questions when you take the test. So there are strategies. You'll be basically have an advantage over somebody who's next to you. He just walks in and decides to take the math test if you have some strategies of how to answer. And then finally, to practice with the content questions and the strategies that we introduce in this class. So as far as equations, I wanted to show you some of those. Let's go here. The equations that you'll need to be pretty much learning and remembering and practicing, there are algebra equations, like linear equations of slopes and things. And if you scroll down here, I'll go through this all in detail, not today. There are slope and y-intercept formulas. There are logs that we would have to go over, statistics like mean, median, and mode type things, probabilities, which we would want to go over. This is going to go on for quite a while. Geometry like area, perimeter, volume of triangles and parallelograms and things. The Pythagorean theorem, it goes through, and kind of some different formulas for circles, area, circumference, things like that. And some trigonometry is kind of at the bottom, and we've got that SOHCAHTOA if you are there yet in your math classes. If you're not, again, no big deal. Sine, cosine, and tangent. So that's kind of an overview of some of the formulas you'll need to remember. So let's get started.